Vision space suggests that we need to think very carefully about what we mean by our stimuli. To what degree does the structure of the stimuli we feed into the visual system reflect prior beliefs we hold about vision? To what extent does the structure of our stimuli affect experimental results and reinforce prejudice? Does the current structure of stimuli actually negate any pretense of experimental objectivity with respect to the system under investigation? Have we constructed a hall of mirrors? The answer to the question in the title is our limited understanding. The structure inherent in the stimulus will determine not just what we make of it in the conceptual sense after processing the information structured within it, but also the degree to which it interfaces with the brain with respect to the visual pathways and the diagnostics involved in cue development. Just because we can rationalize that a stimulus contains a picture of a bus running down Oxford Street does not mean that the depiction passes through or engages the brain in the same way as direct exposure to the real setting. The question to form is actually the opposite. To what extent does the picture accord with our direct perception of the scene? Similarly, by reducing the stimulus to what are thought to be simplistic elemental components, such as an ink blot, a geometric form or diagram that may or may not be configured to induce illusions, we are not making the situation clearer by doing so. Reductionist stimuli are not what they purport to be. They do not do what they say on the tin because the visual system evolved to deal with the complexities of generating our relationship with the real settings, the environment, and not these crafted 2D artificial stimuli. Even the geometry of central perspective is just that, a geometry. We must always touch base with the experiential. If we don't, we will just get lost. It matters not what we think about vision. It matters what presents as vision. So how to proceed? Vision science needs visual artists who engage directly with the phenomenon of vision and who develop strategies to depict that encounter in their work. We need to look very carefully at these strategies to try to understand why they were adopted and evaluate how successful they are. Is there a lineage and discernible progression? The vision sciences should encourage direct experiential encounter within its ranks through life drawing and painting. Its findings should look for discernible articulation within the phenomenon. As visual artists clearly indicate, this is not a simple undertaking. The work of visual artists contain the most valuable resources on earth pertaining to the human umwelt, and this remains largely untapped by science, hiding in clear view. Certain preconceptions about vision that still hold sway within the visual sciences ensure that much of what is considered to be the mainstream within the relevant disciplines is at least one step removed from the subject they purport to be studying. The ontology reflected in the development and selection of stimuli simply does not engage with the phenomenon in the way science envisages. Vision cannot be deconstructed in that fashion. The stimuli are therefore compromised. The same is actually true for much of what passes as visual art these days, where similarly the so-called mainstream merely illustrate their rather weak ideas. It's the same disease. There is little point in me addressing those kept in the fringes who do understand the situation, and this presentation is therefore directed at those who are already irritated by what has been said. The prevailing situation is untenable. It needs to be moved on, and we now have both the means and the opportunities to strike. But doing so requires the active support of the vision sciences. To support this initiative, funds held by the mainstream that would otherwise be directed to the reinforcement of the status quo need to be diverted to the exploration of the human umwelt. This process will need to not just actively involve experiential practitioners, it will need to be led by their ontology. Given the radical nature of this proposition, and that it would never be supported from a standing start by either the research community or developed upon by the commercial sector, It has taken 30 years of independent and unsupported work effort to break this impasse, to develop the basic platform. The intuitive study of the phenomenon of vision has led to the formation of a new form of illusionary space based on perceptual structure and termed vision space. Vision space supersedes picture space, central perspective, and optical projection. It reveals that vision is entirely non-photographically rendered and provides stimuli that can be evaluated. The basics of the data structures involved, together with the exchanges of information taking place within the phenomenal field, have been recorded and encoded into first-generation software. The post-production tool can be used to generate early examples of vision space media, but the control of the variables should enable in-depth evaluation. We have the basis through which the science community can start to develop and evaluate the human umwelt, and around which artists can focus their ongoing explorations. This work has been catalogued as best I can with Zero Finance in a series of online presentations, and the Vision Space programming code is available open source. What I want to concentrate on here is the importance of breaking science's reliance on an out-of-date approach to vision by providing a replacement structure for stimuli, one dependent on the experiential ontology. Vision space should be able to be used to establish certain aspects of the differential or shortfalls implicit in the former paradigm. The lessons that could potentially be learned from this could not be more fundamental. Unless the differential is understood and accounted for, we should suspend all our results, evaluations, and judgments obtained from exposing individual to artificial stimuli. Without reconsideration, what could the results obtained actually mean? To understand this position, we need to think about the underlying fundamentals of vision space. These suggest that there are two independent processing channels, with their own distinct and independent computational processes, each taking something different from the light array. As a consequence, we would have to consider very carefully how we approach the visual system with artificial stimuli, if we wanted it to respond in a typical manner, performing in accordance with its evolved function. We would have to understand the nature of the computational systems within the respective pathways prior to attempting to stimulate them. The primary function of the explicit system appears to be to explore areas of interest in detail, with attention moving from place to place, and to modulate the available data sets from each fixation to generate impressions of objective form. Stimuli would have to be prepared in such a way as to be meaningful to the two computational processes. Vision space would suggest that we currently don't understand this situation adequately. The shortfall in understanding being responsible for deficient stimuli being inappropriately presented to the visual system, resulting in compromised, confusing, and often misleading data. The primary function of the explicit system appears to be to explore areas of interest in detail, with attention moving from place to place, and to modulate the available data sets from each fixation to generate impressions of objective form. This system involves detailed impressions of small areas, decontextualized from the rest of the scene, but often relying on contextual awareness to promote these areas of interest. How the visual system detects the raw data, streams it, prepares the cues from these data sets for contemplation, is going to be specific. Where the explicit processing system addresses what is being considered through time, the implicit system provides the context, addressing where the action is taking place in time. How the visual system detects this raw implicit data, streams it, processes, sets it out, and attends to it is, once again, going to be specific. A generalization would suggest that the explicit system is tasked to consider the world from a third-party remote perspective, whereas the implicit system establishes how we are subjectively factored into the scenario. Two independent takes on the real, with their own distinct forms of attention. So the structure of raw data emanating from the real setting is of paramount importance. It would appear that a form of decoherence is taking place within the retina, and that the resulting datasets prepared for independent streaming. The datasets streamed to the two pathways have been conditioned by the environment and brought to us by electromagnetic radiation, light, belonging to the micro, not the macro scale it is reporting on. We should be surprised if the phenomenon of vision isn't watermarked by these circumstances. If this conditioning is absent from the signal, then it's absent. Our current technologies are not designed to extract this data potential from the light array. If we wish to stimulate the pathways to perform typically, the best way to do this is to expose the retina to the environment at photopic levels. A 2D stimulus with a purely optical imprint is not going to suffice. As far as I am aware, no artificial stimulus thus developed could hope to feed the visual system appropriately. This is not the same thing as saying that it's impossible to do so, but why not use the natural environmental conditions? In contrast, most of the stimuli developed to act as stimuli are highly structured. Photographs, videos, filaments, patterns, diagrams, drawings, paintings, none of these could possibly activate the visual system in a way commensurate with direct exposure to a real setting. And again, as far as I know, it's only certain visual artists working from life and literally a handful of vision scientists working sympathetically with psychophysical methodologies that deal first-hand with experiential reality. These endeavours will at least result in stimuli or results that are commensurate with our perceptions of vision, holding the capacity to tell us something about perceptual structure and the human umwelt. The rest operates hands-off, away from the coalface, with highly structured media without first accounting for the shortfall. Consequently, it becomes highly pertinent to ask what is being actually encountered and measured. If our understanding of the duality that we assume to be emanating from the physical nature of light and so becoming enmeshed into visual process, enabling the self-organization of mind, were not in place, and as a result inadequate artificial stimuli were presented to the system, we should not expect typical mental activity to be the result. It will be atypical. This situation would raise apparent complexity and compound problems, not elucidate and resolve. The most aware of the researchers operating with these constraints would start to feel for a silent or covert processing system, but be unable to move towards a greater understanding of it. So we need to understand more about what we are stimulating before we develop artificial stimuli to probe it. Do we want the visual system to process a situation as though it were a real setting performing all its natural functions, or simply present it with pre-structured information? In the case of pre-structured information, we are essentially inviting that information to be read, not processed, from the stimuli. Optically structured media is highly structured. We will not read that information in the same way that we would from an experiential encounter, diagnosed direct from the real setting. Reading information relies on the explicit pathway and is therefore a process that all but excludes the implicit pathway. We're not going to be actively attending to the data providing us with where the piece of paper is as we engage with the illusionary space printed on its surface. Doing so would break or counter the illusion. Implicit spatial awareness is currently not referenced in our media. Indeed, we are required to ignore what that channel or pathway is telling us about a situation. We've learned to turn it off, something that animals don't do, and so are not that interested in watching television. It's not reality. It's not engaging for them. Even in vision space media, with the implicit field hardwired into the presentation and articulating spatial awareness, we're not processing this from the stimuli. We're not developing that information. It's been provided for us to read, but at least it is there. We can judge the spatial situation as though we had processed the information from the real setting using the final stages of the implicit processing system. We can also now explore the implicit spatial relationships using our explicit processing system, this experience being entirely novel. However, the depiction of the implicit field can also suggest to us a good deal about the processing system that gave rise to it. For example, it can indicate what the computational system is likely to be, and therefore what it is that neuronal receptive fields are actually detecting from the light array, and why they fire as they do, and why they are ranged as they are. When we present stimuli to the visual system, we have to understand what that information means to the respective pathways that feed the system. This has to be addressed and asserted for testing on an experiential basis. We can then form the following questions. We can only start to be exacting about these vital issues if we've resolved the fundamentals and understand how to stimulate the visual system in a controlled way. We need an academic programming architecture for vision space.